You're welcome to Mktg 305, Consumer Behavior. Section 8 will now focus on consumer learning. Our focus is on consumer learning. My name is Dr. Prince Kodria. An overview. In this section, we will attempt to discuss how consumers acquire purchase and consumption-related knowledge for future decision-making. Learning theories which are relevant to marketing will be explained in the process. The key topics to be covered. We'll look at the role of consumer learning in relation to marketing. There are two schools of thought as to how consumers learn or how they acquire marketplace information for future-related decision-making. But for our purpose, we only focus on some behavioral learning theories. In the process, we'll look at classical conditioning, we'll look at operant or instrumental conditioning, and then if time will permit, we'll look at vicarious learning. And then we'll look at the implication for marketing strategy. This is your reading list. At the end of the session, you can look at the reading list. Where possible, I'll direct you via Sakai for you to do further reading. The question I pose is, why are marketers concerned with how individual consumers learn? It's simple, because in a competitive marketplace, we want to be able to elicit favorable responses from our target market. So it should be possible for us to teach marketers or give them reasons to prefer our brands over those of competing brands. Therefore, marketers have the responsibility to teach consumers to prefer their brands and differentiate them from other competitive offerings. Consumers make decisions based on knowledge, whether high involvement or low involvement purchase decision. So how consumers acquire marketplace information for consumption-related decision-making is important. Like I said, there are two schools of thought. The cognitive school simply has to do with how consumers process information. So it has to do more with what goes on in the mind when consumers are exposed to stimuli in the marketplace. Behavioral learning theories has to do with consumer exposure to stimuli in the marketplace. But these theories pay little attention to what goes on in the mind. It assumes a kind of a knee-jerk approach to decision-making, sees the consumer, if I can say, like a kind of a robot who is likely to act in a predictable way when they are exposed to stimuli or stimulus in the marketplace. But like I said, our focus is on the behavioral theories. Let's attempt some kind of definition. From our perspective, that is marketing, learning is the process by which consumers acquire the purchase and consumption knowledge and experience that they apply to future-related behavior. We acquire knowledge for future decision-making in relation to goods and services. In this definition, there are some keywords that we need to address. We are saying that first, learning is a process. In other words, there's no destination to learning. We are exposed to stimuli on a daily basis, and therefore, it's not like a destination. It's an ongoing process. Knowledge evolves based on what we are exposed to. We revise our schemata about the marketplace or certain market offering based on the things we are exposed to. So knowledge acquisition in this regard is a process and has ramification for marketing strategy. Experience in the definition does not mean that all learning or knowledge acquired are consciously or deliberately sought. It's not always that we make deliberate effort to acquire knowledge. It's true that much of learning is intentional, because when we are motivated, when we are faced, when the need is activated, we make conscious effort to acquire marketplace information, to make informed decisions as consumers. But we also need to recognize that the experience as used in the definition also mean that learning can also be incidental. Sometimes we don't make conscious effort. We acquire it accidentally as we move about doing our daily, our normal activities. We are exposed to certain information. And this can go on to affect our knowledge base or our schemata about certain brands or market offerings. Behaviors used in this definition, we are not only referring to actions that can be seen. We are also interested in overt actions. I mean, what goes on in the mind. In other words, when consumers are exposed to stimuli in the marketplace, it leads to, they form certain intentions and memories and all that. As marketers, we should also be interested in what consumers think about stimulus or stimuli that they are exposed to. We are not only interested in behavior that is observable. So behavior in this case simply refers to both unobservable cognitive activity and the observable overt actions in the marketplace. In trying to, though as can be expected, scholars have varying views as to how learning takes place, but there seems to be some kind of agreement in terms of the elements that help us to explain learning. And these elements, there are 4 important elements that scholars tend to agree on that are useful in our quest to understand consumer learning. One is motivation, 2, cues, response, and reinforcement. What are we saying? Motivation is an important starting point of learning. A consumer who is highly motivated or whose needs are activated will seek marketplace information. So for us to understand learning, we need to understand consumer needs, so to speak. In other words, the exact nature and strength of this element, these 4 elements, will influence what will be learned. In other words, the level of motivation will influence the extent that the consumer will go in terms of knowledge acquisition. And then, of course, what will be learned and the rate at which learning will progress. The 4 factors, these points are important in terms of the 4 elements of learning. We are saying that motivation is based on needs and goals, and therefore motives, I'm using motives and needs and goals interchangeably here. Therefore, consumer motives stimulate or act as a spur to learning. In other words, it drives learning. So it's important that we need to motivate consumers, we need to understand consumer needs in that regard to kickstart the process of learning. For instance, a person who wants to embark on an EMBA program will be motivated to seek information. Thus, the degree of relevance or involvement determines the consumer's level of motivation to search for knowledge or information about product or service. This will mean that our ability as marketers to uncover consumer motives is very important in the scheme of things. What are cues? Another element of learning. Cues are stimuli. Anything in the marketing environment that can elicit our attention is a cue. Beyond consumer motivation, cues are stimuli that give or provide direction to consumer motives. We are motivated, but it's the cues in the environment that will tell us how our needs can be satisfied. So advertisements may serve as cues, price tags may serve as cues, atmospherics may serve as cues, retailers or frontline staff, what have you. These are all cues that may provide direction to our motives. Beyond need activation, we need cues to provide us direction as to how a given marketing offering can help satisfy our need. So pricing, styling, packaging, advertising, and store displays, among other considerations, all serve as cues to consumers to help consumers fulfill their needs in product-specific ways. The marketer's duty in this scenario, therefore, is to provide cues that are consistent with consumers' expectation. Different cues may mean different things to different segments. That is why marketers need to understand the nature of the market segment that is being targeted and provide the relevant cues to drive the actions towards need satisfaction. We are saying that for cues to serve as effective stimuli, marketing mix elements must reinforce each other. What it means is that marketing mix elements should be consistent in terms of projecting a positioning. The packaging, the pricing, the distribution strategy, the promotional outlets, and so on should speak with one voice. They should communicate the same thing for us to achieve maximum communication impact. In other words, the cues used should reinforce each other. You are positioning your brand as a market leader, yet your salesmen do not appear, they don't appear as such. You may be sending inconsistent messages and all that. The environment where the service is being delivered does not communicate that positioning. This may lead to confused branding and wrong positioning. So we are saying that for cues to be important element of learning, they should reinforce each other. That's why sometimes we talk of integrated marketing communication mix. And then response is also important. Simply has to do with the outcome. The outcome will help consumers to learn for present and for the future. So it refers to, response here refers to the individual's reaction to drive or a cue. In other words, how the individual behaves constitutes response. Therefore, I'm saying that learning can occur even when responses are not overt. Like I said, where responses are not open and observable, learning can still take place, because we are also interested in what goes on in the mind when consumers are exposed to a given market offering or stimulus. There are several cues or stimuli craving for the attention of consumers. Therefore, they are competing for consumers' attention. Thus, marketers must create favorable images of the brand in consumers' mind if they are to be competitive. And therefore, responses depends heavily on previous learning. We can also talk of reinforcement in this regard. Reinforcement here refers to any stimulus that increases the tendency of specific responses to occur or reoccur in similar situations. In other words, all things being equal, where consumers have positive experience with an offering or a stimulus, they are likely to reinforce the same action or behavior when similar need is activated in future. So reinforcement increases the likelihood of a repeat behavior or action. The opposite too is true. That's why we can talk of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. A consumer who is dissatisfied or not pleased with a service experience is likely to avoid the brand in question in future decision making. Let's look at some of the learning theories and the behavioral learning theories. Classical conditioning. Classical conditioning was made popular by a psychologist by name Ivan Pavlov. This theory is simple. It simply says that consumers learn by means of repetition and association. Classical conditioning, the whole theory, the thesis of the theory is simple. It says consumers learn by means of repetition and association. In other words, conditioned learning results when a stimulus can be anything, that is paired with another stimulus, elicit a known response and serve to produce the same response when used alone. That's where we talk of learning by association and repetition. We will explain this with a diagram soon. In other words, individual consumers, we are saying that one can get, or marketers can get people to like a brand by associating it with a pleasant stimulus. We can get consumers to react favorably to an offer by associating such stimulus or offer with a pleasant stimulus or cue. For instance, events, music, celebrity or personality, images, etc. can be used to elicit favorable responses from our target market. A brand can be associated with this, can be associated with events, music, celebrity, personalities, images, that the target market, or that are pleasant to the target market. How did Pavlov demonstrate his theory? Let's look at the next slide. Okay, so let's look at a model of classical conditioning. Our good friend Pavlov experiment is simple. A dog that is hungry is highly motivated, and therefore, when a highly motivated dog is exposed or is given food or meat, naturally that dog will salivate, or at the sight of food or meat, the dog will salivate. Pavlov's concern was to find out whether the dog can be made to produce the same response or outcome using a different stimulus. So what Pavlov did, the experiment was that simple. You know, there's a natural relationship between food and salivation. A dog that is hungry is highly motivated. So the dog is exposed to food or sees food, will therefore be anxious to salivate and all that. So what Pavlov did was to accompany the feeding of the dog with the ringing of bell. So anytime he wants to feed the dog, he rings the bell simultaneously. And then the dog salivates. You realize that between the meat and the dog, because that is a natural relationship, a dog sees meat, salivates. The meat, in this case, we refer to as unconditioned stimulus. We don't have to do anything for a dog to salivate at the sight of food or meat. So that is more like an automatic relationship. That relationship is given, it's natural. But we wanted to find out if we can condition the dog using a different stimulus to produce the same response. That's how come the experiment decided to accompany the feeding of the dog with the ringing of bell. So this went on repeatedly. Over time, it was observed that after a repeated pairing of the meat and the dog, over time, just at the sound of the bell alone, the dog salivates. In other words, after pairing the meat, after accompanying the feeding of the dog with ringing of bell, over time, the dog has been conditioned, or the dog has learned to associate the bell with the meat. In other words, just by hearing the bell alone, the dog was able to salivate, or the dog salivates. This led to what we call classical conditioning, which is simple. It means learning takes place by means of association and repetition. In other words, when we associate, consumers learn by association and repetition. Let's see, well, there's my good friend Gorilla here. You see a product being associated with a strength. Think of it. What do you think the marketers are trying to achieve? Ordinarily, gorilla is a very strong animal among various animals. They are very strong, they are very firm. When they are in the forest, they hold branches and all that. They are trying to show how strong this glue is. So based on knowledge of classical condition, they are associating this gorilla with the glue. In other words, just trying to communicate the idea that this glue is very strong and very, is strong in terms of its adhesive properties. In other words, the gorilla, on a normal day we see gorilla, we associate the gorilla with strength. So they are trying to communicate to us that this glue is strong. Hence the pairing of, or the use of gorilla to market this brand. There are some strategic applications of classical conditionings. There are three basic concepts. We can talk of repetition, stimulus generalization, and stimulus discrimination. These are some concepts that we derive from classical conditioning. We realize that conditioning only took place through repetition. The dog only learned to associate the ringing, the bell with food after repeated trials. The relevance for us here is that for us to get consumers to acquire positive knowledge about our offerings or brand, marketing communication must be repeated over a period of time. But there's this argument also that too much repetition, though repetition is useful for retention to take place, too much repetition can also lead to what we call advertising wear out. In other words, it will minimize, when we repeat marketing communication too much, sensation will be reduced. So repetition is useful, but marketers need to be aware of extent of repetition. That's how come sometimes marketers vary their marketing communication, though the communication objective may be the same, but because of advertising wear out, marketers may do what we call cosmetic variations to marketing communications, or may sometimes change the marketing communication strategy altogether to avoid advertising wear out. So repetition is a useful concept that we derive from stimulus, classical conditioning. We can also talk of stimulus generalization. In the experiment that we explained, in the Pavlov's experiment, he realized that although the dog was responding to the sound of a bell, over time the dog also learned to react in a similar way to other sounds similar to the ringing of bell. In other words, the dangling of keys that appears like or sounds like bell also got the dog to salivate over time. So this led to another strategic application that we refer to as stimulus generalization. In other words, consumers have the ability to generalize. So let's see how this is applicable in marketing. They're saying that learning depends not only on repetition, but also on the ability of individuals to generalize. Pavlov's dogs will also salivate when exposed to other noises similar to bells. This is known as stimulus generalization. So now, the principles of stimulus generalization is applicable in several ways, but we can mention about 4 applications here. It allows us to do what we call product line extensions, category extension, family branding, and line extension. Product line extension simply means because consumers can generalize, we can introduce a relatively new brand under an existing brand name, normally a very successful brand name which has built equity in terms of increased awareness, perceived quality, positive brand image, or brand loyalty. We can take advantage of that brand name to introduce another product in a given product line. In other words, when you look at the alcoholic beverage industry, let's say Guinness is a known brand, I mean, there's perception of quality and all that. They have the option, if they want to introduce another drink, another product within that product line, they can choose to introduce it under a different name altogether, or introduce this new item or product or brand under existing name. What it means is that because consumers have the ability to generalize, they are likely to transfer those positive effects or effects onto the new brand. That this is a brand of high quality, this brand has high image or positive associations. They are likely to transfer their loyalty onto the brand. So marketers can, based on classical conditioning, marketers can do what we call product line extension to benefit from an already successful brand by using the name of an already existing brand that is successful. The same thing can be done for category extension. Similar to line extension, category extension simply means a producer can decide to capitalize on the positive or the good name or the brand equity of an already established brand to go or to introduce products into a different category. A brand may be known in a particular category, maybe well established, maybe UT, financial services, maybe initially they were doing a kind of niche banking and all that. After the brand has built a lot of equity in terms of brand awareness, image, loyalty, and so on. Now, as part of their growth strategy, they've decided to go into other areas like real estate, insurance, and other areas. They have the option of introducing or going to these new categories under different brand name, but they are trying to rely on stimulus generalization based on classical conditioning to introduce these new products into new categories just to benefit from the already established UT brand name. Same is family branding. An already established brand can be used, the brand name can be used for all items, all brands marketed by a given company. This is because consumers have the ability to transfer the positive effects or the positive images they have of the established brand onto the new brand. So the new brand will not struggle initially for acceptance or recognition, perception of quality, and so on. Will easily be transferred onto the new brand. The same is with licensing. An already established brand, one can have the option of starting a new business under a different brand name. But where one wants to tap into an already established brand, one can buy a license which will allow it to use the processes or other relevant elements of an already established company or brand. It happens a lot in oil marketing, where individuals with the relevant resources can acquire license to set up new filling station and all under the same and already established brand names like Total's, Shell, and so on and so forth. These are all based on classical conditioning. Although consumers have the ability to generalize, hence the concept of stimulus generalization, which I've just explained, in the marketplace, we've also observed that consumers have the ability to discriminate among competing offerings. Hence, this is the basis for positioning strategy in marketing. Over time, consumers, as they are exposed to stimulus or stimuli in the marketplace, over time are able to learn to differentiate among brands, hence the basis for product differentiation. So the question is, how can marketers differentiate their offerings from those of competitors? Mostly marketers rely on marketing communications by communicating the unique benefits of a market or a unique benefit of a given offering. Let's move to another theory under behavioral learning theories. Now we want to talk about operant or instrumental conditioning. What does this theory say? It's simple. It says consumers learn by means of trial and error process. Learning, we said, is a process. This one says consumers learn by means of trial and error, in which some purchase behaviors result in more favorable outcomes and vice versa. In other words, the outcomes that are favorable are likely to be reinforced in future purchase situation, and the opposite too is true. On the screen, on the slide, you will see a model to illustrate the trial and error process. It's simple. Somebody who is in the market to buy, who needs jeans, who wants one that fits well. So this model is simple. This person tries brand A, finds some fault with it. Maybe the legs are too loose, tries brand B. Also, there's no reward because it's tight in seat, in terms of the seat of the jeans. Tries brand C. This one too baggy. Goal-oriented consumer will go on with the process. Try brand D. This time, he finds one that is perfect. So we are saying that not only does repetition happens, learning happens by means of association and repetition, but learning also takes place by means of trial and error. And learning takes place in the process, depending on the outcome. We can talk of positive and negative reinforcement. I've explained this previously. Let's look at some marketing implications of operant conditioning. If we say consumers learn by means of trial and error, there are several implications. One, we need to encourage product trial. If they learn by means of trial and error, where practicable or where possible, marketers must encourage trial, especially in a new product situation, because consumers learn by means of trial and error. Two, because consumers learn by means of trial and error, and there are several alternatives in the market, marketers or businesses need to make conscious effort to satisfy customers the first time. This can be like a mirage. There can be conscious effort, but marketers or businesses cannot always satisfy customers the first time. But what we are saying is that there should be conscious effort to try to satisfy consumers the first time because of the issue of negative and positive reinforcement. Where consumers are dissatisfied, chances are that they may not patronize our services again. But notwithstanding all the systems that a business or a marketer can put in place, service delivery may sometimes go wrong. This will lead us to the third point. Hence, the need for marketers who are forward-looking, they need to put in place what we call service recovery strategies, because regardless of how sophisticated your system is, regardless of how you've deployed technology, or regardless of how you've trained, the kind of training you've given to your employees, service delivery can go wrong. And because consumers learn by means of trial and error, we may lose their lifetime value in terms of repeat purchases and so on and so forth. Hence, there should be conscious effort to put in place service recovery strategies so that in the event that things go wrong, we can recover their service and gain their loyalty. Because we know that satisfied customers are beneficial to the organization. We may benefit in terms of repeat purchases, we may benefit in terms of referrals, and hence we should be talking of customer lifetime value. Hence, prudent organizations or marketers need to put in place service recovery strategy. They need to think through the possible things that may make a service go wrong and devise appropriate strategies just to win back lost customers when it happens. So I'm saying that marketers also need to put in place service recovery strategies to take advantage of customer lifetime value. When we appreciate what we mean by customer lifetime value, we are talking of the stream of income that we are likely to benefit from one satisfied customer, from repeat purchase, referrals, and so on and so forth. 4, in terms of implication for marketing, because consumers learn by means of trial and error, marketers need to provide customers with variety or alternatives. Where there are limited alternatives, consumers do not have the chance, they are unable to do the trial and error process. Because the trial and error process moves them more towards satisfaction because they would have tried and compare and evaluate. They are in a position to evaluate. So where possible, marketers need to provide customers with variety or alternatives. Because where there are alternatives, it increases the chances that they will make the right choice and be satisfied. Again, we can relate the 4th point to the fact that where there are alternatives, it reduces post-purchase dissonance. In other words, once the customer has had the opportunity to try other ones before settling on one, this feeling of satisfaction is higher than where he or she didn't have the opportunity to try other alternatives. So it should be possible for marketers to provide consumers with alternatives to reduce post-purchase dissonance as well. The last model under the behavioral learning theories we want to look at is modeling or vicarious learning, observational learning. We are saying apart from consumer learning by means of trial and error or learning by means of association and repetition, it's not always that learning takes place through, it's not always that learning takes place through direct experience. Learning can also take place vicariously or through observation. In other words, It's not always that we need to get consumers to try products for them to develop or have certain opinions or attitudes about the offering. Now, what are some of the implications for this? I mean, learning by means of, by way of observation. Before I come to that, we are saying that the individual consumer who observe a product in use, all things being equal, will imitate or model the positively reinforced behavior when faced with similar situation. I mean, we observe colleagues based on certain purchase and consumption decisions they make, and we imitate such behaviors based on the outcomes. And then when we are faced with similar purchase challenge or situation, we put on or we do the same thing. So we are saying that learning can also take place based on observation. What is in this for marketing? Some marketing application or strategies of observational or modeling of vicarious learning include exhibition. These things can be discussed in detail. So you need to look at all the nuances that has to do with exhibition. Marketers can deploy these strategies. Where possible, there should be exhibition. Marketers can do some kind of demonstration where they don't have to experience the product directly. Marketers can resort to the use of testimonials, but of course there should be issue of believability. We can also expose consumers to arts depicting the product or service in action. It should be graphical enough. We can resort to what we call test driving or sampling, just to give the consumer an idea. We can do some video presentation. We can do product placement in movies, We can make use of models or celebrities. Vicarious learning is also popular or commonly used in public policy ads and social marketing campaigns and so on and so forth, where the marketer's goal is to bring about some behavioral changes in society. This mostly they do through, they are able to achieve behavioral change by way of observation, because it's not in all cases when you want people to reduce their speed and all that, they don't have to experience it directly. I mean, you can show them videos of people who were involved in overspeeding and the consequences thereof. The question I ask the students is to start thinking about, is learning a predictor of behavior based on the things we've studied, classical conditioning, operant learning, and observational learning? Is learning a predictor of behavior? You can read this, suggestions I've given here as to whether learning is a predictor of behavior. Thank you. We've come to the end of the section.